to paraphrase just a little bit, actually a lot of it, Joseph's story in Genesis, being one of many brothers, I know there are blessings that were supposed to go to one brother that there's a little bit of deception and went to another brother. There's a whole bunch in Genesis that, a lot of details that is worth reading through the entire story. Those brothers, out of resentment for him, sold him into slavery to the Egyptians, right? And he then ends up basically being a slave and then going to prison, and then in prison reveals that he has some type of connection to the Spirit, to God, and is able to what's the word? To guide people through essentially what their dreams mean, right? So there's two people in prison that have dreams. He's able to interpret dreams. One of those interpretations is about an upcoming famine, which gets the ears of Pharaoh, and Pharaoh's like, oh, okay, well, I want to know what my dream... Oh, no, he interprets a couple dreams, and then he gets to Pharaoh's dream, and then Pharaoh has one about famine, and Joseph interprets that dream to the Pharaoh. This is going to happen. This is what it means. This is what God told me it means. And so then Pharaoh takes him out of prison and puts him in this high position of basically managing the land, right? So there's Pharaoh, and then he's kind of like he's like an assistant, I guess, but like a glorified, like in the corporate world, it would just be like an admin, right? Like he's on the same level technically as like the other admins, but because he's Pharaoh's admin, he's kind of like royalty a little bit, and he gets to make decisions over the land and kind of manage this famine that's coming. Anyway, so imagine being in a family where there's always been turmoil based on the order in which you were born and who is supposed to be the blessed one. And then one brother tries to steal that blessing from the other one by tricking the father. And there's a whole bunch of like deceit and all this other stuff in the family among the brothers. Okay. And then they sell you. So we've all had issues with our siblings, right? And then they sell you into slavery. There's other stuff that happens too, kind of bad details about how crappy that whole situation was for Joseph. And then he ends up, they're like, forget you, we're leaving you behind. We're just going to tell dad that we found some bloody clothes or whatever, and we're eaten by a beast or killed by somebody. Okay, imagine that. You get sold into slavery, you're in another country, and then that country puts you in prison, and there's a whole bunch of stuff after that, a lot of details that are even crappier for Joseph. The decision for his brothers to do that to him led to so many bad things in his life. And so you fast forward to being in prison, the revelations or the interpretations of Pharaoh's dream, Pharaoh elevating him to a super high status. And then because the famine starts, his brothers go to Egypt because that's where they can buy food and a whole bunch of other stuff. So the father, who's still alive, says, hey, brothers, go to Egypt, buy a bunch of stuff, take this money, buy a bunch of stuff, basically so we can survive. So they go there, and Joseph is the one that's selling it to them. And Joseph doesn't recognize his brothers at first. He kind of says, like, hey, go back and, go get your youngest brother or whatever. There's a couple details in there to go back to their home and then come back with more family members. I think it's another brother. So anyway, they don't really recognize him right away. When they come back the second time, Joseph recognizes his brothers and then weeps and says, I'm your brother. There's one brother, I think it's Benjamin, that he hasn't met yet. So anyway, there's a family reunion. Everyone's crying. And this is what Joseph says. And this is Genesis chapter 45. Come closer to me. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come closer to me. And they came closer. He said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. And then it goes on to say, it preserved life because of the famine, right? So it goes on to say, for the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years to go because the famine was supposed to last for 7 years. Okay, all that crap they went through, all that crap, his brothers started the first domino in that his crappy life so far, right? He says to them, do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. Just sit back for a second, in the concept that he was able to, in that moment, put all of the crap aside because he understands the bigger picture. He understands God's plan and his place in it, and he understands how he's working through God to bring those interpretations to Pharaoh, to help people through a famine, right? How incredible is that, to put that aside? And these are your brothers, and say, don't worry about it. God sent me before you to warn Pharaoh the famine, to get all these resources, to bring my family, which ends up being like 60-something people, right? There's daughters and sons and grandkids and all sorts of stuff. He ends up saying, bring everyone, I have a plot of land for you. Even Pharaoh agreed at that time, like, yeah, let's just give him the best. You'll eat the fat of the land and all this other stuff, right? So that's an incredible feat for a man to put that stuff aside. And we all know, we all have our own examples of this, but it's an incredible feat to put that aside for the greater good, and to just assure them, like, don't worry about it. Yes, everything happened, but that was before, and now we're in the present, and there's actually a famine going on, and I'm working through God to make sure we all survive, right? And it makes me think that not only is that like, I just wrote a note here that says, what the ... because I don't know how I would be able to do that in that moment. Obviously he's in a great place now, so he feels a lot better about his life and himself. I get that. But man, to be able to do that in the moment would be so hard. And the second point that makes me think of is perhaps the reason he was able to do that is because he was walking God's path. He was walking his path, which was God's plan for him. If he wasn't doing that, if he wasn't interpreting dreams and working through God's spirit, God's energy, and basically going down that path that God needed him to go down, which was crap. He got sold, right? There's a lot of stuff in the household of the master he was serving at that time when he was a slave, and then a lot of weird stuff that you could read in Genesis. But this whole path that was God's plan, and he was walking it. And how much harder would it be to do this with his brothers if he wasn't walking God's plan? I would say probably impossible. It's already hard to do something like that, but probably impossible if he wasn't walking God's plan. He wasn't living out God's plan. So that one just took me back this morning. The ability to do that, perhaps, maybe for me, maybe I'm just speaking for me, only exists if I know that I'm following God's plan and I'm helping people, which is he thought he was doing, right? He said there's a famine coming. Guess what? We're 2 years into it now. Oh, looks like he was right. There's 5 more years left. And he's trying to help as many people as possible. And God put him through all that stuff to get to that point to help his family, because his family obviously is very important, as we see in Genesis. And so that was the outcome of the plan. And maybe he was only able to do that because he knew that he was living out God's plan. And how do we tap into that? How do we know if we're living God's plan? How would we be able to forgive like this? We have to discern whether we're living through God's plan or not. And how do we do that? Fundamentals: prayer, church, confession, communion, reading scripture, consistency, being more like Jesus, Beatitudes, all the stuff we talk about all the time. That's how. And spending time in the Spirit, chasing more ways in which we can be in the Spirit more often and more consistently. Amazing piece of forgiveness unbelievable, actually. And it makes a little bit more sense when you know that he was living God's plan, which is why he was so confident and so able to forgive. But it doesn't make that much more sense. Even then, on paper, it seems impossible, right? Just thinking about yourself in that scenario. But he did it, and it's a great example of forgiveness and how we can put that aside. The stresses between us humans and the things that go on between us on this earth. Putting that aside, or tailoring your reaction and your responses to those things based on the plan you're walking with God. So I wanted to share that with you today.